They sent an army to a Deathworld. Only one survivor made it back. By the end of the first week, General Koval had lost 900 soldiers. He did not release that number to the broader command structure. He filed the losses under a category called environmental attrition, a label that suggested expected and manageable casualties rather than something that should concern anyone. He told himself that the first week of any planetary campaign always had rough edges. Things would stabilize. The humans would see the scale of the invasion and fall into the kind of disorganized, fragmented resistance he had dealt with on other worlds. It always happened that way. He was still telling himself that when the volcano in Iceland erupted. The Vorath Air Support Wing, 60 gunships assigned to cover the northern hemisphere, had been staging out of a flat coastal plain that thermal scans showed as geologically stable. The scans were 3 weeks old. They had not accounted for a pressure shift deep beneath the surface of a volcanic island that sat directly on the boundary between two of Earth's tectonic plates. The eruption sent a column of ash 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. All 60 gunships were grounded within 2 hours. The ash particles were fine enough to bypass the engine filters and dense enough to turn rotary blades into scrap metal if anyone was foolish enough to attempt flight. It took 11 days to clear enough of the ash to resume operations. 11 days without air support over the northern hemisphere. The humans used every one of those 11 days. A commander named Kang, a man who had spent 20 years leading mountain infantry units in one of the rougher border regions of Korea, had been watching the Vorath northern deployment since the first landing. He was not a famous general. He was not a highly decorated officer. He was simply a man who understood terrain the way a carpenter understands wood, by instinct, by feel, by a lifetime of working with it every day. Kang looked at the Vorath positions and saw exactly what he was looking for. They were moving through the mountains the way flatland soldiers move through mountains. They were taking the obvious routes, the wide passes, the trails that showed up clearly on any map. They were setting up camps on the high ground because high ground looked defensible, without understanding that high ground in those particular mountains meant exposure to wind patterns that could drop visibility to 0 in under an hour. Kang split his unit into groups of 8. He gave each group a simple set of instructions. Do not engage frontally. Do not fight on ground the enemy chooses. Hit and move. Always move uphill after contact, because the Vorath soldiers in biosuits were slower going uphill than going down. The ambushes were not spectacular. They were not the kind of thing that would make dramatic footage. A group of 8 soldiers would appear on a ridge, fire for 30 seconds, and vanish into the rock before the Vorath could organize a response. A unit moving through a narrow pass would find the trail blocked by a collapsed section of hillside. Not a bomb, just a pile of rocks that someone had loosened the night before. Supply lines were cut, not with heavy weapons, but with small teams that moved at night, in weather that made the Vorath sensors unreliable. In 11 days, Kang's forces accounted for over 300 Vorath casualties without losing more than 40 of their own. But the humans weren't only fighting with guns. In the Vorath Eastern Deployment Zone, across the wide, flat lowlands of Bangladesh, the monsoon arrived. The Vorath meteorological team had flagged the region as potentially high rainfall during the current season, but had assessed it as manageable. They had calculated rainfall averages and run projections. What they had not accounted for was the particular behavior of that year's monsoon, heavier than average, arriving 2 weeks early, and pushing inland with the kind of force that turned dry flatlands into shallow lakes in under 48 hours. The Vorath Eastern Column had advanced 40 kilometers inland when the rains began. They were equipped for heavy rain. They were not equipped for what came next. The ground simply ceased to behave like ground. Vehicles that had moved smoothly across hard-packed earth began to sink. Heavy equipment bogged down. The soldiers in biosuits found that the suits, which handled cold and heat and atmospheric toxins, had not been designed to operate when the seals around the joints began accumulating water pressure from wading through thigh-deep floodwater for hours at a time. 14 vehicles were abandoned in the first 3 days. The column's advance halted entirely. And then the infections began. The Vorath biosuits were excellent pieces of engineering. They filtered out known biological threats. The problem was that Earth's microbial environment had spent billions of years becoming extremely good at finding ways into things that tried to keep it out. The suits were rated for Class 5 biological environments. Earth, it turned out, should have been rated Class 8. Microbes found their way through joint seals, through air filtration membranes, through the small cracks that formed in suit material after extended field use. The Vorath medical team had brought treatments for known pathogens. Earth's pathogens were not in any database. The medical team began losing ground on day 5. Soldiers who had been perfectly healthy started running high fevers. Some recovered quickly, some did not recover at all. By the end of the second week, Koval had 12,000 soldiers. By the end of the third week, he had fewer than 7,000. And the humans had barely used their actual military yet. This was the thing that Rena had tried to explain in the council chamber, and that nobody had wanted to hear. The resistance that was grinding the Vorath army down was not coming from organized military units with heavy weapons and coordinated strategy. It was coming from hunters and mountain soldiers and farmers who knew the land. It was coming from the planet itself, from weather systems and volcanoes and floods and microbes that had been dealing with invaders for millions of years before humans ever arrived. But the humans were learning, and the ones who were learning fastest were the ones with access to technology. In a communications bunker somewhere in Seoul, a young signals officer named Yuna had been working without sleep for 4 days straight. She was 26 years old. Before the invasion, she had spent her career doing fairly routine military communications work. Encrypting messages, monitoring frequencies, writing reports that mostly nobody read. She was good at her job. She was also, in her spare time, very good at the kind of abstract puzzle solving that most people would call code breaking. The Vorath communication system used a layered encryption protocol that their own analysts rated as unbreakable by any civilization below a Tier 4 technological level. Earth was rated Tier 2. Yuna broke the primary encryption layer in 51 hours. She did not do it with advanced equipment. She did it with pattern recognition, sitting in front of a screen, running analysis after analysis, sleeping for 2 hours at a time on a cot behind her desk, eating instant noodles cold out of the container because she didn't want to waste time on a microwave. When the first decoded Vorath battle plan transmission came through, she stared at it for a long moment. Then she picked up her phone and called her commanding officer. "Sir," she said, "I need you to come to the bunker. I have something." Within 18 hours, human commanders across 6 continents had Vorath movement orders, supply routes, and command frequencies sitting in their hands. Koval never understood why his flanking maneuvers kept walking into prepared positions. He never understood why his supply convoys seemed to be hit before they arrived. He blamed his own commanders for information leaks. He blamed the terrain. He blamed the weather. He did not consider the possibility that a tired 26-year-old woman eating cold noodles in a basement had simply outthought his best encryption team. By day 25, Koval had fewer than 4,000 soldiers left. He sent an urgent message to the High Command requesting reinforcements. The High Command sent back a request for a full status report. He sat down and began writing the status report. It took him 3 attempts to start it, because every version he wrote made the situation sound like something that should not be possible. Eventually, he just wrote the numbers. He did not have an explanation for the numbers. He was not sure any explanation existed. Outside his command ship, somewhere in the forest below, it was raining. They sent an army to a death world. Only one survivor made it back. The landing went smoothly. That was the first thing that gave the Vorath commanders false confidence. 12,000 soldiers descended from orbit in 400 dropships, spreading across 6 different landing zones on the planet's surface. The drops were clean, the equipment arrived intact, and the local human military response, though fast by primitive standards, was disorganized and scattered. The humans had clearly never dealt with an orbital insertion before. Their communication systems were slow. Their chain of command was confused. For the first 6 hours, General Koval felt very good about how things were going. Then the reports started coming in from the forward units. Sergeant Day had been assigned to lead the northernmost scout unit, 40 soldiers tasked with pushing into the dense forest region of a territory the humans called Siberia. It had been chosen because it appeared largely uninhabited on the thermal scans. No major human settlements, no visible military infrastructure, a clean entry point. Day was experienced. He had served 12 years in the Vorath military. He had been in 5 planetary campaigns. He was not the kind of soldier who made careless mistakes. He led his unit into the forest at midday. By nightfall, 22 of his 40 soldiers were dead or missing. Not one of them had been killed by a human weapon. The first problem was the cold. The thermal reports had listed the temperature of the region at -20 degrees Celsius, which the biosuits were rated to handle comfortably. What the thermal reports had not captured was the speed at which the temperature could drop. Within 3 hours of entering the forest, a weather system moved in from the north that pushed the temperature down to -53. They were not designed for that rate of change. 4 soldiers went down in under an hour, their suit systems overwhelmed, their bodies unable to generate enough heat. Day ordered a retreat toward the ships. The forest did not make it easy. The terrain was nothing like the training environments the soldiers had used back home. The trees were enormous, some of them 30 meters tall, packed so densely that the squad's navigational equipment gave conflicting signals. The ground beneath the snow was broken and uneven, full of hidden drops and frozen streams that looked like solid ground until a soldier stepped on one. 3 more soldiers were lost to injuries from falls before they had covered half a kilometer. Then the animal appeared. One of Day's soldiers, a young trooper named Paul, was separated from the main group by about 15 meters when the brown bear came out of the tree line. Paul saw it. He raised his weapon. He fired twice. The rounds hit the animal. The animal did not stop. It covered the distance between them in under 3 seconds, and Paul was gone before anyone could reach him. 2 more soldiers who ran toward the sound were also killed, before the rest of the squad managed to drive the creature away with concentrated fire. Day stood in the snow and looked at what remained of his unit, and said nothing for a long moment. He had seen large predators on other worlds. He had never seen something take 2 direct hits from a Vorath military rifle and continue charging. The after-action analysis would later confirm that the animal, which the humans classified as a common regional predator, had a body mass and pain tolerance that simply absorbed the initial damage. It was not a military creature. It was not trained. It was simply built that way. Then, an hour later, the human appeared. Day almost didn't see him. The man stepped out from behind a tree, about 80 meters away, wearing thick animal skin layered over what appeared to be simple insulated clothing. He was carrying a long rifle, a basic human firearm, nothing special. He stood in the snow and looked at the Vorath unit with an expression that Day would later describe in his report as completely calm. Not frightened, not angry, just calm, the way someone looks when they are doing a familiar task. His name was Tay. Day would not learn that until much later. Tay raised his rifle. He fired once. One of Day's soldiers dropped. He moved 2 steps to the left, fluid and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. He fired again. Another soldier dropped. He was already moving before the second shot finished echoing through the trees, sliding behind a thick trunk, angling, reappearing at a completely different position. He fired a third time. The fourth shot was never fired, because by then, Day had ordered the unit to scatter and take cover. And by the time they reorganized and pushed toward where Tay had been standing, there was nothing there but snow and boot prints that disappeared into the trees within 30 meters. They followed the prints for 20 minutes. Then the tracks simply ended at the edge of a frozen stream. No sign of which direction he had gone. No sign that he was nearby. He had walked into the forest, and the forest had swallowed him completely. Day sent the report to Koval with hands that were not quite steady. He listed the losses: 22 soldiers from one scout unit, 4 to cold, 3 to terrain injuries, 2 to a local predator, 3 to the single human shooter, the rest missing, either lost in the forest or dead in ways he hadn't yet confirmed. He added a note at the bottom of the report. The human did not run. He did not panic. He selected positions, used cover, moved between shots. He operated in the environment as if the cold and the forest were normal to him. He did not appear to be military. He appeared to be a hunter. He was alone. General Koval read the report. He was quiet for longer than usual. Then he called his senior commanders together and told them to push the timeline forward. The scout delays were unacceptable. The operation needed to move faster before the humans could organize a real response. None of his commanders pointed out that the scout delay wasn't caused by the humans organizing. It was caused by a single man with a rifle who went for a walk in his forest and came home for dinner. Back in the Vorath command ship, Ambassador Rena received a copy of the scout report. She read Day's note at the bottom twice. Then she set the report down and looked at the wall for a long time. She had known a man like Tay back in Korea. Not a soldier, just a man who knew the land and moved through it like water moves through a river, without effort, without thought, because it was simply what he knew. She had asked him once if he had ever been afraid in the mountains. He had thought about it seriously, the way Koreans often thought about things before they answered. Sometimes, he had said, but the mountain doesn't care, so I just keep moving. Rena looked at the scout report and thought that General Koval had no idea what kind of people lived on this planet. She hoped, quietly and without much conviction, that she was wrong. They sent an army to a Deathworld. Only one survivor made it back. The Vorath High Command had never lost a war. Not once, not in 400 years of expansion across the galaxy. They had taken planets from species that had faster ships, bigger weapons, and stronger armies. They had crushed civilizations that had been fighting wars for centuries before the Vorath even learned to build their first spacecraft. Every time, the result was the same. The Vorath came, they fought, they won. Then they moved on to the next world on the map. So when the scout ship returned from the Sol system with its report, nobody in the High Command was worried. The report was simple. The third planet from the star, the one the locals called Earth, was a primitive world. The dominant species had only recently learned to split the atom. They had no energy shields, no faster-than-light travel. Their weapons were basic chemical propellant devices that fired small metal projectiles. Their military vehicles ran on ancient fossil fuels. By Vorath standards, they were barely worth classifying as a threat. The planet itself, however, was another matter. The scout team had flagged it as a Class 7 Deathworld. The atmosphere was loaded with a highly reactive gas called oxygen, the same gas that had killed 2 Vorath engineers during an unshielded surface test. The gravitational pull was stronger than what most Vorath soldiers trained in. The temperature range across the planet's surface was extreme, from -80 degrees in some regions to over 50 degrees in others, sometimes shifting violently within a single-day cycle. The planet had active volcanoes, tectonic plates that moved and cracked without warning, massive ocean storms that could stretch for hundreds of kilometers, and wildlife that ranged from enormous land predators to microscopic organisms capable of bypassing standard biofilters. The scout team's recommendation was simple: proceed with caution. General Koval read the report once and laughed. He was a tall Vorov, broad-shouldered with gray-green scales and small yellow eyes that always looked slightly bored. He had led campaigns on 11 worlds. He had never lost a soldier in battle that he didn't consider acceptable. He set the scout report on his desk and leaned back in his chair. "It is a primitive world," he said to his officers. "The environment is hostile, yes. That is why we bring full biosuits and environmental shielding. The humans, that is what the locals call themselves, have nothing that can stop us. We go in, we neutralize any resistance, and we claim the planet within 30 standard days." His officers agreed. They always agreed with General Koval. There was, however, one voice in the room that did not agree. Ambassador Rena sat at the far end of the council table. She was smaller than the military officers around her, with a quieter way of speaking that most of them found easy to ignore. She had spent 3 years on Earth before the annexation order was issued. She had lived among the humans, studied them, eaten their food, learned 2 of their languages. She knew things about them that no scout report could capture. She raised her hand and waited to be acknowledged. General Koval nodded at her, the way someone nods at a minor inconvenience they are obligated to address. "General," Rena said, keeping her voice calm, "I would ask the Council to consider delaying the operation. Not canceling, delaying. The scout report is accurate in its facts, but I believe it is missing important context about the human species." "Such as?" Koval asked. "They are not like other primitive species we have encountered," Rena said. "Most Class 1 civilizations, those without interstellar travel, respond to first contact with either complete surrender or brief disorganized resistance. The humans are different. Their entire history is built on conflict. They have been fighting each other continuously for as long as their written records exist. They fight over land, over resources, over ideas, over things that have no material value at all. They do not surrender easily. In many cases, they do not surrender at all." "That is an interesting cultural note," Koval said. "It does not change the fact that we have 12,000 elite soldiers, and they have rifles." "They have considerably more than rifles," Rena said. "And the planet itself, the environment, the terrain, the wildlife, the microbes, it has been killing them for their entire existence. They are not frightened of it. They were built by it. A soldier who has spent his life training in controlled environments will not react the same way as a creature that grew up in a Class 7 Deathworld." The room was quiet for a moment. Then one of the other generals made a small sound that was the Vorath equivalent of a polite laugh. "Ambassador Rena," he said, "are you suggesting that a species with chemical propellant weapons and fossil fuel vehicles poses a serious threat to 12,000 Vorath troops in full battle equipment?" Rena looked at him steadily. "I am suggesting that we do not fully understand what we are walking into." The vote was taken. The operation was approved. 12,000 soldiers under General Koval's command would deploy to Earth within the next standard week. The goal was annexation. The expected resistance was minimal. The projected timeline was 30 days. Rena sat quietly as the meeting ended, and the officers filed out, already talking about the next campaign, the next planet after Earth, as if this one was already finished. She did not file a formal objection. She had already filed 3. None of them had been read. Instead, she went back to her quarters and sat at her desk for a long time. She thought about the 3 years she had spent on Earth. She thought about the people she had known there, the ones who had shown her kindness, the ones who had made her laugh, the ones who had told her stories about their wars, and their history, with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of people describing the weather. She thought about one evening in particular, sitting in a small house in the mountains of a country the humans called Korea. An old man had shown her a wall in his home, covered in photographs. Some smiling, some not. He had pointed to each one and told her their stories, where they had fought, what had happened to them. Some had come home, some had not. He had told the stories of the ones who hadn't come home with the same steady voice as the ones who had. She had asked him, that evening, if the humans ever got tired of fighting. The old man had looked at her for a moment. Then he had smiled, a small and patient smile. "We get tired," he said. "We keep going anyway." Rena sat at her desk and thought about that smile for a long time. Then she began writing a private report, not for the high command, because they would not read it, for herself, a record of what she believed was about to happen. She titled it simply, "What We Don't Know." When she was done, she saved the file, locked it, and went to sleep. 7 days later, the fleet entered Earth's orbit. The operation began on a Tuesday. They sent an army to a Deathworld. Only one survivor made it back. Lieutenant Rowe did not know he was the last one alive. He found out slowly, the way you find out about most terrible things, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece arriving just as you were starting to feel stable again. First, the eastern column went silent on the communications network. Then the northern units stopped responding. Then the command ship signal, which had been steady and reliable since the day of the landing, simply disappeared one morning between one transmission and the next. Rowe was alone in a rice field in the south of the Korean peninsula, lying face down in 6 centimeters of standing water, too exhausted to move. He had been a logistical officer before the invasion, not a frontline soldier. His job had been to manage supply routes and equipment inventories. He was competent, organized, and careful, which were not the same as being prepared for what the last 2 weeks had done to him. He had watched his entire forward supply unit die over the course of 4 days. 2 to an ambush he still didn't fully understand. 3 to the bacterial infection that had been working through the eastern deployment. 1 to a fall in the dark that Rowe had been unable to prevent. And the last one, in a way, Rowe didn't like to think about. He had been moving south for 6 days on his own. He was running on a small amount of ration paste, contaminated water that his suit filter was struggling to process, and a level of physical exhaustion that had moved beyond pain into a strange gray numbness. He was wounded in his left side, not critically, but badly enough that every step pulled at something that wasn't healing the way it should. When he stopped moving in the rice field, he genuinely did not know if he was stopping to rest or stopping to die. Both options seemed about equally likely. He was still lying there when Hana found him. She was the village medic for the small community that farmed the land around that particular stretch of paddies. She was not a doctor. She had nursing training, 3 years of working with the Rural Health Service, and a practical knowledge of injuries that came from living in a place where the nearest hospital was 2 hours away. She was in her mid-30s, with a calm face and very direct eyes, and she made her decisions quickly and without visible emotion. She looked at Rowe for a moment, at the Vorath biosuit, the alien equipment, the clearly non-human proportions of the figure lying in the water, and then she made her decision. She called 2 of the village men over, and they carried Rowe into a storage building near the edge of the field. She cut away the damaged section of his suit, found the wound, cleaned it, packed it, and bandaged it. She did this competently and without conversation, which was fine, because Rowe was barely conscious. She set up a fluid line, using materials she had clearly improvised, because no medical supply chain had ever been designed with Vorath anatomy in mind. And she sat with him through the night, checking his temperature regularly and adjusting whatever she was giving him with the focused attention of someone solving a problem. By morning, Rowe was conscious enough to understand where he was. He stayed for 2 weeks. He was not a prisoner. That was the first thing that confused him. Nobody locked the door. Nobody stood guard outside. On the 3rd day, when he was strong enough to sit up and look around, Hana brought him food. Actual cooked food, warm, in a bowl, and set it in front of him, and gestured for him to eat. It tasted strange, and he didn't know what most of it was. And it was the best thing he had ever eaten in his life. He had no way to contact the Vorath fleet. His personal communications equipment had been damaged sometime in the last week of the campaign. The command ship was still silent. He was, by every practical measure, stranded on an enemy planet with no rescue coming. He should have been terrified. He was too tired to be terrified. So instead, he sat in the storage building and recovered. And in the slow quiet of those days, he began to watch. The village was small, maybe 80 people. Farmers mostly, with a few who did other kinds of work. They went about their days with the steady, unhurried rhythm of people who have been doing the same work for a long time. Children played in the yards between the houses. Old people sat in doorways and talked. Meals were cooked and eaten. Fields were checked and maintained. And at the edges of everything, quietly and without any apparent drama, life continued as if the invasion had been an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe. One morning, a man sat down on the step outside the storage building and began sharpening a knife. He worked steadily, running the blade across the stone in long, smooth strokes, pausing occasionally to check the edge with his thumb. He was maybe 50 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending a lot of time alone outdoors. This was Tay. Ro recognized him from Sergeant Day's report, which he had read weeks ago. The man who had walked into the Siberian forest and killed 4 Vorath scouts and vanished into the snow. Ro had read that report and tried to understand it, and mostly failed, because nothing in his training or experience had given him a framework for a single individual who could do that and then simply go home. Now he was sitting 5 meters away, sharpening a kitchen knife, making a soft, rhythmic sound in the morning quiet. Eventually Tay looked up and met Ro's eyes through the open door of the building. He held the look for a moment, direct, calm, without hostility. Then he looked back at his knife and kept sharpening. That evening, Ro watched Tay eat dinner with his family through the window of the storage building. A woman about his age, 2 children, young enough to still be noisy at the table. Tay poured something to drink, said something that made the woman laugh, and then sat back and let the children talk over each other the way children do. Ro watched this for a long time. He had spent the last month watching his army dissolve. He had watched soldiers die from cold and rain and infections and animals and ambushes. He had seen the results of what human fighters could do when they knew the ground they were standing on. And now he was watching the man who had walked into a Siberian forest and killed 4 armored soldiers with a rifle. Watching him pour drinks for his family and laugh at his children's stories, and look exactly like someone who had put his workday behind him and was glad to be home. The horror of the contrast was not loud. It was quiet, and it settled into Ro the way cold settles into a building, slowly, through every gap, until it was just the temperature of the room. These people were not warriors the way the Vorath were warriors. They were not a military culture with a military identity. They were farmers and hunters and medics and signals officers who happened to also be, when the moment required it, devastatingly effective at violence. And then the moment passed, and they went home and cooked dinner. Ro thought about the 12,000 soldiers who had landed on this planet. He thought about what it said about a species that this had happened to 12,000 trained soldiers. And the people responsible for it were currently arguing about bedtime with their children. On the 11th day, Hana came to check his wound and found him standing, which she seemed to take as sufficient evidence of recovery. She looked at him in a direct, appraising way, and then she said something in Korean that his translation module, still functional at least, rendered as, "You look better." "Yes," Rose said through the module. "Thank you." She nodded. She looked at him for a moment, as if she was deciding something. Then she said, "You can leave when you want. Nobody is stopping you." Rose stayed for 3 more days. Not because he had nowhere to go, but because he wasn't finished trying to understand what he had seen. He had the feeling, unusual for him, that he was looking at something important, and that if he left before he understood it, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He never fully understood it. But on the 14th day, a Vorath extraction vessel, responding to his emergency beacon, which he had activated on day 10, appeared above the village. He stood in the field where Hana had found him, and looked at the ship descending. He looked back at the village, at the smoke rising from the cooking fires, at the children in the yard, at Tae standing at the edge of his property, watching the ship with the same calm expression he used for everything. Ro raised his hand. Tae raised his hand back. Then the ship came down and took Ro home. He sat in the extraction vessel and looked at the planet through the porthole as it grew smaller. He was not thinking about the campaign. He was not thinking about the losses or the reports he would have to file. He was thinking about what he was going to say when they asked him what happened. He was thinking that whatever he said, it would not be enough. They sent an army to a death world. Only one survivor made it back. The hearing room in the Vorath High Command was the largest chamber in the building. It had seating for 400. The walls were made of dark, polished stone. The lighting came from long strips set into the ceiling that produced a cold, even glow, with no warmth in it at all. It was designed to feel serious and important, and it succeeded. People who entered it for the first time almost always straightened their posture without meaning to. Lieutenant Rowe had been in this room twice before, both times as a junior logistics officer attending routine supply reviews. Both times he had sat near the back and tried to look competent. Today he sat at the single table in the center of the room, facing a raised platform where 31 senior officers and council members sat looking down at him. General Koval was not present. Koval had filed his final report from orbit, and then requested a medical evaluation, which was one way of saying that he was not ready to sit in a room full of people yet. The seat where he would have sat was conspicuously empty. Rowe set his datapad on the table. He placed his hands flat on either side of it. He looked up at the council. The presiding officer, Admiral Veth, a short Vorath with pale scales and 30 years of command experience, looked back at him. "Lieutenant Rowe," Veth said, "you are the only surviving officer from the Earth campaign with direct command-level experience. This hearing has been convened to receive your account. Please begin when you are ready." Rowe looked down at his datapad. It contained numbers, coordinates, timeline data, casualty logs, all the things a proper military report was supposed to contain. He had spent 6 days on the extraction vessel, writing it. It was thorough and precise and completely accurate, and he had decided, somewhere over the outer edge of Earth's solar system, that he was not going to read from it. It wasn't necessary. He looked back up at the council. "I'll answer any specific questions you have about the data," he said. "But I'd like to start by just telling you what I saw." Veth raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Rowe talked for 40 minutes. He did not use military language. He did not use the structured report format that Vorath officers were trained to use. He talked the way he had been talking to himself in his head for the 2 weeks he spent in that village. Plain and direct, trying to describe things that he still wasn't sure he had the right words for. He told them about the cold in Siberia, and how the forest had eaten a 40-soldier scout unit before a single human fighter arrived. He described what Sergeant Day's report had said about the hunter, the way he had moved between positions without hurry, firing with precision, and then simply walked away into the trees. He told them that the hunter's name was Tay, that he lived in a small village, that he had a family, and that nothing about his life suggested a man who thought of himself as a soldier. He told them about Kang and the mountain ambushes. He described the way that unit had operated, the patience of it, the complete comfort in terrible weather and difficult terrain, the way human soldiers seemed to treat discomfort as a simple fact of life rather than something to be managed and minimized. He told them about Yuna. When he mentioned that a signals officer had broken the primary Vorath encryption protocol in 51 hours using pattern recognition and no specialized equipment, the room went very quiet. He described her working conditions. The basement bunker, the cold noodles, the 2-hour sleep intervals, and he watched several of the council members exchange looks that he recognized as the kind of looks people exchange when they are recalculating something important. She was not a cryptography specialist, Rowe said. She was a communications officer who was good at puzzles. She did it because it needed to be done, and she was the person available to do it. That is, he paused, looking for the right words, that is a pattern. It is not exceptional. It is how they work. He told them about the flood, the volcanic eruption, the bacterial infections. He was careful to describe these as planetary conditions, not human military strategy. He wanted the Council to understand that the Earth campaign had not failed because of a single clever enemy move that could be countered. It had failed because the entire planet was the enemy, and the humans were the planet's most successful inhabitants. Then he told them about the village. He told them about Hana. He described waking up to find that a human woman had spent the night keeping him alive, an enemy soldier from the species that had come to conquer her world, using improvised materials and practical skill, and apparently no particular emotional conflict about the decision. He described it plainly and without trying to interpret it, because he still wasn't sure he understood it. He told them about watching Tay at dinner. He told them about the children arguing at the table, and Tay pouring drinks, and the woman laughing. He said, "The man who killed 4 of our armored soldiers in a Siberian forest came home and made dinner for his family." He did not appear to regard these as unusual or contradictory things. They were both just things that he did. The room was completely silent. Rowe picked up his datapad. He looked at the numbers on it one more time. "We sent 12,000 soldiers," he said. "We lost all of them, or effectively all of them, within a margin that is not meaningful. We lost them to weather, terrain, biology, and a distributed human resistance that was not coordinated by a central military command, but by individual people who knew their land and were not willing to leave it. We never got close to fighting the human military at full capacity. What we fought was the first layer, the people who were just there." He set the datapad down. "I do not believe that a larger force would produce a different outcome," he said. "I believe it would produce the same outcome with larger numbers. The humans are not an enemy you can overwhelm, because their resistance is not coming from a specific source that can be destroyed. It is coming from the planet, and from the nature of the people the planet made. If we send a larger army, the planet will have more soldiers to kill. If we improve our biosuits, the humans will find a different angle. If we solve the environmental problem, we will still be fighting a species that has been solving environmental problems on a Class 7 Deathworld for 200,000 years, and considers it normal." He looked up at the council. "I think we should talk to them," he said. "Not because we cannot fight them. I cannot assess whether we can or cannot fight them at a level I have not seen. I am saying this because I spent 2 weeks in a village on that planet, and I watched the people there, and I think we do not understand them well enough to fight them, and we probably never will, and that is a problem that will not go away no matter how many soldiers we send." He stopped talking. The silence in the room was very different from the silence that usually followed a military report. That silence was the silence of people processing logistics. This silence was the silence of people who had just had a thought they weren't expecting to have. Then from the back of the chamber, a familiar voice spoke. "Admiral Veth," said Ambassador Rena, "I would like to formally request that the Council authorize preliminary peace negotiations with the human governments." Veth looked at her. Then he looked at Ro. Then he looked at the data pad on the table, with its numbers that should not have been possible. "This Council previously rejected 3 such requests from you." "Yes," Rena said. "What has changed?" Rena was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Lieutenant Ro just described something that I have been trying to find words for since I came back from Earth 4 years ago. I couldn't explain it. I tried 3 times, and nobody heard it." She paused. "He heard it," she said, "because he saw it." Veth looked around the chamber. He looked at the faces of the senior officers and council members, the people who had voted confidently to send 12,000 soldiers to a primitive world and expected them back in 30 days. He looked at their faces now. Nobody laughed. Nobody made the polite Voroth sound that meant they found something unimportant. The vote was held. For the first time in 400 years of expansion, the Vorath High Command voted to request a peace negotiation rather than plan a second campaign. Ro walked out of the hearing room and stood in the corridor for a moment, breathing slowly. He felt very tired, but it was a different kind of tired than the exhaustion of the campaign. Cleaner, somehow. He thought about Hana finding him in the rice field. He thought about her sitting through the night, adjusting his fluids, checking his temperature. He thought about what it took to do that for an enemy, and how she had done it without apparent struggle, as if it were simply the obvious thing to do. He thought that he would like to go back to Earth someday, just as someone who wanted to understand. He thought he could spend a long time on that planet and still not be finished understanding it. He suspected that was probably true of everyone who went there. Somewhere on the other side of the galaxy, on a quiet Tuesday morning, in a small village surrounded by rice paddies, a man named Tay was sharpening a knife on his front step. A woman named Hana was checking on a patient. Children were arguing about breakfast. An old man was sitting in a doorway, watching the light come up over the mountains, the same way the light had come up over those mountains every morning for longer than anyone could remember. The planet turned. The sun moved. The day went on. It didn't notice that it had just stopped an empire.